The fastest way to lose a marriage isn't betrayal, money, or even distance. It's when one person starts believing the other will never leave. The night everything changed for me started with a phone call I almost didn't make. It was 11:18 p.m. and I was sitting alone at the kitchen table of a house I'd spent 15 years helping build. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background. A baseball game played on mute in the living room. Outside, a cold October rain tapped against the windows of our home outside Columbus, Ohio. Jessica had texted earlier that evening saying she was out with friends from work. That wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was that she'd stopped answering messages 3 hours earlier. I stared at my phone, turning it over in my hand. Looking back, I should have listened to the feeling in my gut. Not fear, not jealousy, just the quiet realization that something between us had been slipping away for a long time. I finally pressed call. The phone rang twice before she answered. Music blasted in the background. People were laughing. I could barely hear her voice. "What?" she snapped. I blinked. "Hey, just checking in. Everything okay?" More laughter. A woman's voice somewhere nearby. Then Jessica sighed dramatically. "Daniel, seriously?" I felt my shoulders tighten. "I was just making sure you got there okay." Another pause. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. "Stop calling me. I'm not your property." The people around her laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just enough. Just enough for me to hear it. Just enough for me to understand she wasn't embarrassed by saying it. She wanted an audience. For a second, I stared at the rain sliding down the kitchen window. 15 years together. 15 years of mortgages, family holidays, late-night emergency room visits, career sacrifices, moving trucks, and ordinary Tuesdays. Reduced to a punchline. The strange thing is I didn't feel angry. Not immediately. I felt tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after carrying something too heavy for too long. I looked around the kitchen. The framed vacation photo near the refrigerator. The coffee mug she'd bought me on our 10th anniversary. The stack of unopened mail on the counter. Ordinary things. Familiar things. Suddenly they felt different. Like I was seeing them from far away. "You know what?" I said quietly. Jessica laughed again. "What?" I took a slow breath. "Perfect." The laughter behind her faded slightly. "What does that mean?" she asked. I looked at the front door. At the hallway leading upstairs. At the house that had once felt full and warm and alive. "Then don't come home." Silence. Not much. Maybe 2 seconds. Then she scoffed. "Oh, please." I almost ended the call right there. But something stopped me. Maybe instinct. Maybe clarity. Maybe the simple fact that I was finally done pretending things were normal. "And don't expect the house to wait for you," I said. This time there was no laughter. I heard her shift. "What is that supposed to mean?" she asked. I smiled to myself, though there was no joy in it. "Good night, Jessica." Then I hung up. My phone immediately lit up again. Incoming call. "Jessica." I let it ring. A text appeared 30 seconds later. Then another. Then another. I never opened them. Instead, I sat there listening to the rain. Listening to the refrigerator cycle on. Listening to the silence she'd left behind. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't wondering how to save my marriage. I was wondering why I'd spent so long trying to save it alone. What Jessica didn't know that night was that the house she thought would always be waiting for her had a story she had never bothered to learn. And before the sun came up, everything she believed about our life was about to change. People like to think marriages fall apart because of one big moment, but most of the time they fall apart the same way a house settles into the ground. Slowly, quietly, one small shift at a time until one day a door no longer closes the way it used to. I did not meet Jessica during some dramatic chapter of my life. There were no fireworks, no movie scene, just a crowded coffee shop near Ohio State University and a woman who smiled at me when I accidentally picked up the wrong cup. I was 28 back then, working long hours for a regional shipping company and trying to build something that looked like a future. Jessica was smart, ambitious, and impossible not to notice. She had a way of making ordinary conversations feel important. Back then she asked questions. Real questions. She wanted to know what I dreamed about, what kind of life I wanted, what success meant to me. Looking back, that version of Jessica feels like someone I knew in another lifetime. We got married 3 years later. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony. Close family. A reception in a rented hall with folding chairs and a dance floor that squeaked every time someone crossed it. We did not have much money, but we had plans. At least I thought we did. The first years were good. Not perfect. Real. We argued about bills. We worried about mortgage payments. We spent weekends painting walls ourselves because hiring contractors was not in the budget. Every paycheck had a purpose. Every dollar mattered. I remember carrying boxes into our first house during a snowstorm. The driveway was covered in slush. The furnace barely worked. Jessica stood in the empty living room wrapped in a winter coat and laughed. She looked around and said, "One day this place is going to be beautiful." I believed her. Maybe that was my mistake. I believed everything she said back then. As the years passed, things improved. I worked my way up, then eventually left to build my own logistics company. It was not glamorous. It was freight schedules, warehouse contracts, fuel costs, and thousands of miles on the road. Most people never notice the systems that keep stores stocked and businesses running. That was my world. Long hours, early mornings, late nights. Jessica supported me at first, or at least I thought she did. She celebrated every new client, every contract, every small win. But success changes people sometimes. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it simply reveals who they already are. What I did not know then was that the seeds of our problems were already being planted. Around 5 years ago, Jessica received a promotion at a marketing firm in downtown Columbus. I was proud of her. I took her out to dinner the night she got the news. We toasted with sparkling water because she had an early meeting the next morning. She looked happier than I had seen her in years. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then the dinners started. Then the networking events. Then the weekend retreats. New coworkers. New friends. New priorities. At first, I told myself it was normal. Careers evolve. People grow. Marriage requires flexibility. But little things began changing. Jessica stopped asking about my day. Conversations became shorter. Her phone was always face down. Family dinners became optional. Anniversaries became scheduling conflicts. One night, I spent nearly an hour telling her about a major contract my company had landed. When I finished, she looked up from her phone and asked, "Sorry, what were you saying?" It should not have hurt as much as it did. Yet somehow it did. Because it was not about the contract. It was about realizing she had stopped listening. The strange thing is that I kept making excuses for her. Busy week. Stress. Deadlines. Everyone goes through seasons. That is what people tell themselves when they are trying to save something. But seasons eventually change. Ours never did. Instead, the distance grew. And somewhere along the way, Jessica stopped looking at me like a partner and started looking at me like a permanent fixture. Like the mailbox. Like the driveway. Like something that would always be there no matter how little attention it received. What she never understood was that even the strongest foundations have limits. And by the time she laughed during that phone call, I had already reached mine. The people who influence your life the most are not always the ones living under your roof. Sometimes they are the voices sitting across a restaurant table telling you what you deserve. I did not notice the shift immediately because change rarely arrives with a warning label. It arrives disguised as confidence, independence, or harmless advice. Jessica's new circle of friends seemed ordinary enough at first. Successful professionals. Divorced women rebuilding their lives. Ambitious people climbing corporate ladders. Whenever she talked about them, she described them as empowering, strong, fearless, the kind of people who refuse to settle. I remember hearing those words and thinking they sounded reasonable. Looking back, I should have paid closer attention to what came after them. Every dinner with that group seemed to leave Jessica slightly different when she returned home. Not dramatically different, just enough to notice. She became more critical, more dismissive, more impatient with things she once appreciated. One Friday evening, I spent 4 hours grilling steaks and preparing dinner because she had mentioned wanting a quiet night together. By the time everything was ready, she texted 30 minutes before arriving. "Actually, I'm staying downtown with the girls." Rain check. I stared at the message while smoke drifted from the grill into the cold evening air. The food sat untouched on the kitchen counter. I told myself not to overreact. But moments like that started adding up. Another time I suggested a weekend trip to Lake Erie. Nothing extravagant. Just 2 days away from work and distractions. Jessica barely looked up from her phone. "That sounds boring," she said. Then she laughed and added, "Maybe when we are 70. The strange thing was not what she said. It was how quickly she said it. Like spending time together had become an inconvenience. Around the same time, new phrases began appearing in our conversations. Phrases that sounded borrowed. "You need to stop being so traditional. People grow apart all the time." Not everything revolves around marriage. None of those statements were wrong by themselves, but together they felt rehearsed, like lines from a script someone else had written. One night we attended a company event downtown. I remember standing beside her near the bar while employees and executives moved through the ballroom. Jessica was talking with a group of coworkers when someone asked how long we had been married. 15 years, I answered. Before I could say anything else, Jessica laughed and said, Daniel still acts like we are newlyweds sometimes. The group chuckled politely. Then she added, I keep telling him the world is bigger than our marriage. It was meant as a joke. At least that is how everyone treated it. I smiled because that is what adults do in public. But on the drive home, the silence felt heavier than usual. What I did not tell her was that I had spent months noticing the pattern. Every time her friends entered the conversation, respect seemed to leave it. Every time they praised independence, commitment became something to mock. Every time they celebrated freedom, responsibility became old-fashioned. The woman who once stood in an empty house dreaming about a future with me now talked about our life like it was a limitation she had outgrown. Yet even then I kept trying. Birthdays, anniversaries, small gestures, conversations. I kept believing effort could repair distance. But effort only works when two people are building the same bridge. And somewhere along the way, Jessica had stopped building. She was already facing another direction. The saddest part was that she did not even realize it. She thought she was becoming stronger, more independent, more empowered. What she never understood was that confidence built on disrespect eventually demands a price. And by the time that phone call happened, the bill had already been coming due for a very long time. There is a moment in every failing relationship when you stop asking whether things are getting better and start asking yourself how long you can keep pretending they are. I did not reach that point overnight. It happened gradually, through hundreds of ordinary moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A canceled dinner, a forgotten conversation, a glance at a phone screen that mattered more than the person sitting across the table. By the final year of our marriage, the house felt different. Not empty, not hostile, just disconnected. Like two people were renting rooms in the same building instead of sharing a life. Some evenings Jessica would come home after 9 o'clock, drop her purse on the counter, and head upstairs without asking how my day had gone. Other nights, she would sit across from me at dinner scrolling through messages while I talked about clients, employees, or plans for the future. Half the time I was not even sure she heard me. One evening stands out more than the others. It was our 15th wedding anniversary. Nothing extravagant. I had reserved a table at a small steakhouse we both used to love. The kind of place with dark wood walls, framed photographs of Ohio landscapes, and waiters who remembered regular customers. I arrived 15 minutes early. Jessica arrived 40 minutes late. She walked in carrying her phone in one hand and frustration in the other. Before she even sat down, she said, "Sorry, work was crazy." Then she spent most of dinner responding to messages. At one point I stopped talking mid-sentence just to see if she would notice. She did not. The silence lasted nearly 30 seconds before she looked up and asked, "Why did you stop?" I smiled and told her it was nothing. Looking back, that should have been the moment I understood how far apart we had become. But people do strange things when they love someone. They protect hope long after logic tells them to let it go. So I kept trying. Marriage counseling, weekend getaways, honest conversations. Every suggestion was met with the same answer. Busy schedule, bad timing, maybe later. Later became next month. Next month became next year. Then one afternoon something happened that stayed with me. I was cleaning out old paperwork in my office when I found a folder containing mortgage documents from years earlier. The house, our house, the place where nearly every major chapter of our adult lives had happened. I sat there looking at those papers while sunlight came through the window and dust drifted through the air. Most people see documents and think numbers. I saw memories. The moving boxes. The first Christmas tree. The nights spent planning a future. That was when I remembered a conversation I had almost forgotten. A meeting years earlier with an attorney during the expansion of my business. At the time it had seemed like routine planning. Asset protection. Liability management. Long-term security. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. Just responsible decisions made by a business owner thinking about the future. The memory returned so clearly that afternoon it felt like someone had switched on a light in a dark room. I remember the attorney sliding a stack of papers across the desk and explaining why certain things should be structured carefully. I remember signing documents. I remember filing them away and moving on with life. What I did not know then was how important those decisions would eventually become. Sitting in my office years later, I opened the folder and reviewed everything again. Slowly, carefully. The more I read, the calmer I felt. Not because I was planning anything. Not yet. But because for the first time in a long while, I stopped feeling trapped. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in the backyard. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked steadily forward. And somewhere deep down, a realization settled over me. Jessica thought she understood every part of our life together. She thought she knew where all the pieces were. She thought the future would always unfold exactly the way she expected. What she never realized was that some of the most important decisions had been made years ago, quietly, without applause, waiting patiently for the day they might matter. Some people think the end of a marriage begins with a fight. Mine began with silence. After the phone call, I stayed at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. The rain continued tapping against the windows while the digital clock above the oven slowly moved toward midnight. My phone lit up several more times. Calls, messages, questions. For years I would have answered immediately. I would have explained myself. I would have tried to smooth things over before a disagreement became something larger. That night was different. For the first time in a very long time, I felt no urgency to fix anything. Around 12:30 in the morning, another message appeared. "Where are you?" I stared at the screen and almost laughed. I was exactly where I had always been. At home. The difference was that she was finally noticing. I set the phone face down and walked through the house. The living room lamp cast a warm glow across the hardwood floor. Family photographs lined the hallway. Vacation pictures. Holiday dinners. Smiling faces frozen in better years. I stopped in front of one photograph taken nearly a decade earlier. Jessica stood beside me on a dock overlooking Lake Michigan. Her arm was wrapped around mine. Both of us looked happy. Not social media happy. Not performative happy. Real happy. Looking back, that picture felt less like a memory and more like evidence from another life. Upstairs, her side of the closet sat half full. Designer jackets. Shoes. Handbags. Expensive things collected over years of promotions and bonuses. I looked at them for a moment and then closed the door. The objects were still there. The person attached to them felt increasingly distant. At 1:15 in the morning, my phone rang again. Jessica. This time I answered. There was no music in the background anymore. No laughter. No audience. Just her voice. "What was that supposed to mean?" she asked. I sat on the edge of the bed. What supposed to mean? "You know exactly what I am talking about." I waited. The silence stretched. Finally, she said, "The house comment." I looked toward the window. Rain streaked down the glass under the porch light. "It means exactly what I said." Another pause. "Are you seriously angry over one conversation?" she asked. There it was. The question people ask when they think the problem started today. The truth was that nothing started today. Today was simply the day something ended. "Get some sleep, Jessica," I said. "We will talk tomorrow." Before she could respond, I ended the call. Then I turned the phone off completely. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Habit. Years of running a business had trained my body to start moving before most people poured their first cup of coffee. I drove downtown while the city was still waking up. Traffic lights blinked yellow over mostly empty streets. Coffee shops opened their doors. Delivery trucks rolled through intersections. Ordinary Tuesday morning. Yet something felt different. Lighter. At 8 o'clock, I walked into a law office I had not visited in years. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Mr. Brooks," she said with a surprised smile. "It has been a while." "It has," I replied. 20 minutes later, I sat across from a familiar attorney named Robert Langley. Gray hair, calm voice, sharp eyes, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He opened a file cabinet, pulled out a folder, and placed it on the desk. The same folder I had been thinking about the day before. He slid it toward me. "I wondered if I would ever see you again regarding this matter," he said. I rested my hand on the folder, but did not open it immediately. The weight felt familiar. Years earlier it had represented preparation. Now it represented possibility. Robert studied my expression. "Something changed?" he asked. I thought about the phone call. The laughter. The years of excuses. The slow erosion of respect. Then I nodded once. "Yes," I said quietly. "Something finally changed." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Then perhaps it is time for you to understand exactly what these documents protect." And for the first time, I was ready to listen. The truth about preparation is that it looks boring until the day it becomes important. Robert opened the folder and began walking me through documents I had not reviewed in years. Some carried dates from nearly a decade earlier. Others had been updated as my company grew. Most people hear terms like trusts, ownership structures, and asset protection and immediately imagine complicated legal games. What I saw was something simpler. Responsibility. Years ago, when my business started generating real money, Robert had insisted that I think beyond the present. Good times make people careless, he told me back then. The future rewards people who prepare. At the time, I had been focused on contracts, employees, and expansion. I signed the paperwork, filed it away, and returned to work. Now those same decisions sat in front of me like pieces of a puzzle finally revealing their picture. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed everything. When the meeting ended, I felt something I had not felt in years. Certainty. Not anger. Not revenge. Certainty. Outside, the morning sun reflected off office windows downtown. Traffic filled the streets. Life moved forward as if nothing had happened. In many ways, nothing had. Jessica still believed she understood the situation. She still believed she controlled the narrative. She still believed I would eventually apologize for standing up for myself. What she did not know was that I had stopped reacting emotionally and started acting deliberately. Around noon, my phone came back on. The screen immediately filled with notifications. Missed calls, text messages, voicemails. Most of them followed the same pattern. First confusion, then irritation, then demands. Why are you ignoring me? What is wrong with you? Are you seriously acting like this? I read every message without responding. The absence of a response often tells people more than an argument ever could. Later that afternoon, I returned home. The house felt quiet, peaceful. For the first time in years, I noticed how calm it was without tension hanging in every room. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island reviewing notes Robert had given me. Outside, a delivery truck stopped across the street. A neighbor walked his dog. Ordinary life continued. Around 4:30, my phone rang again. Jessica. This time I answered. Her voice sounded different. Not softer, not apologetic, just uncertain. Where have you been? She asked. I looked at the stack of papers in front of me. Working. I came by the house earlier. I remained silent. The garage code did not work. There it was. The first crack in her confidence. The code had been updated that morning. Not out of spite. Out of practicality. Security systems get updated all the time. Yet somehow she immediately understood that this was not routine. I had to use my key, she continued. Why would you change it without telling me? I took a sip of coffee. Because I wanted to. The silence that followed stretched longer than either of us expected. Jessica was used to explanations, defenses, negotiations. She was not used to boundaries. Daniel, she said carefully, you are making this much bigger than it needs to be. I almost smiled. Looking back, that sentence perfectly captured our marriage. Every concern I raised had been too big. Every disappointment had been an overreaction. Every hurt feeling had been inconvenient. Until suddenly the consequences arrived. Then everyone wanted to discuss proportionality. Maybe, I replied. Or maybe it has been bigger than you realized for a long time. She did not answer immediately. I could hear traffic in the background wherever she was parked. Finally, she said, we need to talk. We will, I said. Soon. Then I ended the call. That evening I sat on the back patio watching the sun sink below the trees behind our property. The air carried the first hints of late autumn. Leaves drifted across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. My phone remained quiet for almost 3 hours. Then a single text arrived. It contained only 6 words. What is happening, Daniel? I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it and setting it aside. Because the answer was simple. For years, Jessica had been watching me adapt to her choices. What she was experiencing now was something entirely different. She was finally being forced to adapt to mine. The following afternoon, Jessica finally came home. I knew she would. Not because I expected an apology. Not because I thought she suddenly understood what had happened. People rarely change that quickly. No, I knew she would come home because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and for the first time in years, she was the one living with it. I was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing paperwork when I heard the garage door open. A few seconds later, the door connecting the garage to the house swung inward. Jessica stepped inside carrying her purse and a look I had not seen in a very long time. Concern. She stopped when she saw me. Neither of us spoke immediately. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows. The entire scene felt strangely ordinary considering how much had changed in less than 48 hours. "Daniel," she said finally. I nodded. "Jessica." Her eyes moved across the kitchen, then toward the stack of folders resting neatly beside my coffee mug. "What is all of this?" she asked. "Paperwork." She crossed her arms. "Do not do that." "Do what?" "Answer questions like that." I almost smiled. For years she had answered serious conversations with dismissive comments and expected everyone else to move on. Now she wanted precision. Funny how quickly expectations change when consequences arrive. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. "Can we have a real conversation?" she asked. "That depends." Her jaw tightened. "Depends on what?" I looked at her for several seconds, long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then I opened one of the folders and slid a single document across the counter. "Depends on whether you are finally willing to listen." Jessica glanced down at the paper. At first she seemed confused. Then she started reading. Her expression changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, just small shifts. Eyebrows tightening, eyes narrowing. The subtle signs of someone realizing they do not understand the situation as well as they thought. She looked up. "What is this?" "Something important." "Daniel." Her voice sharpened. "Stop speaking in riddles." I leaned back in my chair. For years I tried having direct conversations. Most of them ended with you checking your phone. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Jessica looked away first, then back at the document. "This does not make sense," she said quietly. "It does." "No, it really does not." She tapped the page. Why was I never told about this? There it was. The question I had expected. Not concern about the marriage. Not concern about what brought us here. Concern about information she did not have. Looking back, that question revealed more than she intended. "You were told," I replied. "Years ago. You just were not interested." Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. Somewhere in her memory, she was searching for a conversation she barely remembered. A meeting. A discussion. A detail she had dismissed because it seemed boring at the time. I watched the realization slowly form. Not complete understanding. Just enough to create doubt. Her confidence continued slipping. "I do not understand why you are doing this," she said. I looked around the kitchen. At the house. At the life we had spent 15 years building together. "That is the problem," I said quietly. "You think this started this week." Her eyes met mine. For the first time since the phone call, she said nothing. No defense. No joke. No accusation. Just silence. I stood, carried my coffee mug to the sink, and stared out the window toward the backyard. Autumn leaves drifted across the grass. The world continued moving forward. "You remember what you said the other night?" I asked without turning around. Jessica remained silent. "You said you were not my property." The words hung in the air between us. "I know what I said." "Good." I nodded slowly, because that was the first honest thing either of us had heard in a long time. When I turned back around, she was staring at me differently. Not with anger. Not with superiority. Not with certainty. For the first time, she looked like someone realizing the ground beneath her feet was not as solid as she believed. And deep down, I think she finally understood something important. This was no longer a disagreement she could laugh away. The rules had changed, and she had not been paying attention when they did. The next few weeks revealed something that took me years to understand. People show you who they are when circumstances change. They show you even more when comfort disappears. Jessica spent the first several days moving between frustration and disbelief. One moment, she acted as though everything would return to normal if we simply waited long enough. The next moment, she demanded explanations for decisions that had been years in the making. What never seemed to occur to her was that the real issue had never been paperwork, accounts, or legal structures. The real issue was respect. And respect had been leaving our marriage long before either of us admitted it. At first, her friends remained exactly where they had always been. They called. They texted. They invited her out for drinks after work. They reassured her that she was right, that she deserved better, that I was overreacting. I know because sometimes I could hear parts of those conversations from across the room. The advice sounded confident, certain, empowering. But confidence is easy when you are discussing someone else's life. Then something interesting happened. Reality arrived. Weeks passed. The excitement of the situation faded. Her friends returned to their own careers, relationships, and problems. The phone calls became less frequent. The invitations became less common. One Friday evening, I came home after a meeting and found Jessica sitting alone on the back patio. No music, no phone conversation, no social plans, just silence. She stared across the yard as leaves gathered against the fence line. For a moment, she looked like a stranger visiting a place she barely recognized. Looking back, I think that was the first time she truly felt the weight of what was happening. Not because of anything I said, because of what nobody else was saying anymore. Around that same time, small realities started appearing everywhere. The bills she never paid herself, the appointments she never scheduled, the responsibilities she never noticed because someone else had quietly handled them for years. People often misunderstand stability. They think stability is automatic. They think homes stay organized by themselves. They think relationships survive on history alone. The truth is that stability is usually built by someone doing hundreds of small things nobody notices until they stop happening. One evening, Jessica opened a kitchen cabinet and stared at an empty shelf. "We need groceries," she said automatically. Then she stopped. For years, I had handled most of the shopping because my schedule allowed flexibility. It was such a small thing. Yet the expression on her face suggested she was noticing a pattern. Little pieces of life she had taken for granted. Little acts of care she never counted because they always happened without discussion. The following week, she called me during a business trip. Her voice sounded different again. Less defensive, less certain. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." There was a long pause. Then she asked, "When did you stop being happy?" I stood beside the hotel window, overlooking a parking lot filled with rental cars and delivery trucks. The question surprised me because it was the first honest question she had asked in years. "I do not know," I answered truthfully. "Maybe the better question is, when did you stop noticing?" Silence filled the line. Not angry silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind people fall into when they hear something they cannot immediately dismiss. After we ended the call, I stood there looking at the lights across the highway. What I realized then was simple. Jessica was beginning to understand that this was never about winning or losing. It was about value. Not the value of a house. Not the value of money. The value of a person standing beside you every day while asking for very little in return. And for the first time since all of this began, I think she finally saw what had actually been slipping away. The tragedy was not that she might lose a comfortable life. The tragedy was that she was only learning its worth after she had stopped appreciating the person who helped create it. 1 year later, I barely recognized the man staring back at me in the mirror. Not because I looked dramatically different. Life is not a movie. People do not wake up transformed overnight. But there was something new in my reflection. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from no longer fighting battles that were never yours to win. My business was doing well. The long hours still existed, but they felt different now. Purpose has a way of making effort feel lighter. The house was quieter too. Not lonely, just calm. The tension that once lived in every room had disappeared. Some evenings I would sit on the back patio with a cup of coffee and watch the sun settle behind the trees. No arguments. No walking on eggshells. No wondering whether I was asking for too much by expecting basic respect. Looking back, I realized something important. I had spent years trying to save a version of my marriage that no longer existed. I kept hoping the woman I remembered would eventually return. The problem was that people do not return to who they were. They either grow with you or they grow away from you. One chilly October afternoon, almost exactly a year after that phone call, my phone vibrated while I was leaving a client meeting. I glanced at the screen. Jessica. Her name sat there quietly, carrying the weight of 15 years and 1,000 memories. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello." There was a pause before she spoke. "Hi, Daniel." Her voice sounded different. Softer. Older somehow. Not in age. In experience. "How have you been?" she asked. I smiled slightly as I walked toward my truck. Funny question. People always ask how you have been when they really want to know whether you still think about them. "I have been good," I said honestly. Another pause followed. Then she laughed softly. Not the confident laugh I remembered. Not the one from that night. This one sounded almost nervous. "I am glad to hear that." I leaned against the side of my truck and looked across the parking lot. "And you?" I asked. "I have had a lot of time to think." I nodded even though she could not see me. Somehow that answer made perfect sense. Time has a way of teaching lessons that pride refuses to learn. We talked for several minutes. Nothing dramatic. No accusations. No attempts to rewrite history. Just two people speaking honestly for the first time in years. Eventually, her voice grew quieter. Daniel. Yeah, I made a mistake. The words hung there between us. A year earlier, I might have waited my entire day to hear them. Now they felt different. Not meaningless. Just late. I closed my eyes for a second and listened to the distant sound of traffic. Then I replied gently. No, Jessica. She remained silent. You made a choice. Neither of us spoke after that. Sometimes the truth does not need additional explanation. We said goodbye a few minutes later and ended the call. As I drove home that evening, the sky glowed orange over the Ohio horizon. The same roads, the same town, the same life. Yet everything felt different because I finally understood something I wish I had learned years earlier. Love cannot survive where respect disappears. Commitment cannot thrive when appreciation is replaced by entitlement. And no amount of patience can save a relationship if only one person is trying to protect it. The night Jessica demanded freedom, she believed she was escaping limitations. What she never realized was that freedom works both ways. Sometimes the person you take for granted eventually discovers they no longer need your permission to move forward. And when that happens, the story changes forever. If you have made it this far, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts. Do you think Daniel made the right decision, or would you have handled things differently? Share your perspective in the comments because every story teaches something different. And if stories about resilience, self-respect, and life lessons speak to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next journey. Sometimes the hardest lessons leave behind the strongest people.